My neighbor called the cops on me, then she vanished after what they found. It had been one of those never-ending days, the kind where every second drags like molasses, and all I wanted was to finally get home. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the Texas sun had dipped low, casting long, golden shadows across the quiet suburban street. I sighed, feeling that familiar relief, home, my sanctuary, my escape from the chaos. But just as my fingers reached for the ignition, something felt off. The gravel near my front gate didn't look right. A small shift, subtle, but enough to make the latch sit awkwardly. I'd noticed it before, always telling myself I'd fix it later. But tonight, something nagged at me, a feeling I couldn't shake. So, kicking off my work boots, I made my way to the garage, grabbing a shovel. Just a few scoops, smooth it out, and I'd be done. That was the plan. But plans, they have a way of unraveling when you least expect it. Across the street, someone was watching. Someone who had already decided I didn't belong. Margaret Wilkins, my neighbor. I didn't see her at first, but she was there, peeking through the curtains of her perfectly manicured suburban home, phone in hand, convinced she was witnessing something criminal. I was just fixing my own damn driveway, but to her, I was digging suspiciously. While I worked, unaware of her growing paranoia, Margaret's fingers gripped her phone tighter. She whispered into the receiver, her voice low but urgent. "Yes, I'd like to report something suspicious. There's a man, he's digging in a driveway. I don't know if he lives there." The dispatcher asked a few routine questions, but Margaret barely listened. Her eyes never left me, her imagination filling in blanks that didn't exist. I, on the other hand, was just trying to finish before dark. I drove my foot against the shovel, pushing it deeper into the packed earth. Years of wear had made the ground tougher than I expected. That's when I felt it, a hard scrape, something solid. I leaned down, brushing loose soil away with my hands. Not a rock, it had edges, sharp ones, metal. Before I could dig further, the sharp wail of sirens shattered the quiet evening. Red and blue lights streaked across the houses as a police cruiser rolled up to my driveway. I straightened up, hands instinctively stilling at my sides. 2 officers stepped out, 1 man, 1 woman. Their movements were calm, deliberate. But I wasn't naive. I knew they were already sizing me up. The male officer, Carter, spoke first. "Sir, can you step away from the shovel?" I exhaled slowly. "Here we go." Lifting my hands, palms open, I kept my voice steady. "I live here. I'm fixing my driveway. That's it." The female officer, Mitchell, studied me carefully while Carter flicked a glance toward Margaret's house. She was still watching, curtains slightly drawn back, pretending she wasn't the one who called. "We got a report about suspicious activity," Carter continued, his voice even. "From who?" I asked, already knowing the answer. Officer Mitchell's gaze flickered toward Margaret's window for a split second. She knew. I knew. But this wasn't about what was fair. It never was. I gestured toward the spot where I had been digging. "Look, I was just trying to fix the latch on my gate. That's it." But whatever was buried under there had caught more than just my attention. Officer Carter took a step forward, his eyes narrowing at the freshly disturbed soil. "What do you mean, something?" I crouched down, pointing to the metal edge barely peeking through the dirt. "I don't know what it is, but it's buried deep, feels old. Been here a long time." For the first time since they arrived, they weren't just looking at me, they were looking at it. Officer Mitchell knelt beside me, sweeping away some of the loose dirt with her gloved fingers. The moment they scraped against metal, she frowned. "It's a box, a locked one." Carter let out a slow breath, glancing toward the street as if running through a mental checklist of protocol. "We're gonna have to open that." Across the street, Margaret was still watching. Only now, she wasn't just a nosy neighbor calling the cops on the guy next door. Because this wasn't the outcome she had expected. Not at all. Mitchell tapped the top of the box, listening to the hollow, metallic sound beneath her fingertips. Rusted, old, sealed tight. The kind of thing that had been underground for years. Maybe decades. Carter took a step back, assessing. This doesn't look like some random toolbox. Someone put this here on purpose. I swallowed hard, my mind racing through every possible explanation. I had owned this house for 5 years. Before me, it belonged to an older couple, quiet, kept to themselves. And before them, no idea. We need to open it, Mitchell said, her voice steady but firm. I glanced up at Margaret's house. The curtain had shifted. She wasn't standing there anymore, but I could feel her presence still watching. Still listening, Carter pulled a pair of gloves from his belt and crouched beside the box. If it's locked, we have two options. We either take it downtown and process it, or... Before he could finish, I grabbed the shovel and wedged the tip against the rusted latch. One firm push, crack, the lock snapped. The box groaned as I lifted the lid. The hinges resisted at first, stiff with age, but then... It opened. The smell hit first. Deep, stale, the kind of scent that had been trapped for too long, turning rancid over time. The kind that made your throat tighten on instinct. The kind that told you whatever was inside was never meant to be found. Mitchell took a step back, her nose wrinkling. Oh, that's not good. I hesitated. Then I looked inside, and my stomach twisted. Bones. Small, fragile-looking bones, wrapped in what was left of an old, tattered cloth. And beside them, a stack of photographs. Black and white, faded, their edges curled with age. I picked one up, a little girl, maybe 6, maybe 7, frozen in time, her eyes wide, hollow, staring back at me from the past. Everything else faded, the cops, the sirens. The cold night air settling in around me. All I could see were those photographs, that cloth-wrapped bundle. That rusted box that had been sitting beneath my driveway this whole time. Carter muttered something under his breath before standing up straight. We're gonna need forensics out here. Now, Margaret was gone. She wasn't peeking through the curtains anymore. She had vanished from her window entirely. But for the first time tonight, I wasn't thinking about her, because whatever this was, whatever had been buried here, was bigger than some nosy neighbor calling 911. The air felt different now. It wasn't just the smell, it was the weight of it. Carter took a step back, his hand already on his radio. Dispatch, we need forensic support at this location. Possible human remains discovered. His voice was steady, but I heard the edge in it. Mitchell knelt closer, pulling a flashlight from her belt. She shined it over the bones, careful not to touch them. The fabric they were wrapped in had almost completely disintegrated, but beneath the dirt and decay, there were still traces of color. Pink. It had been a blanket once. A weight settled in my chest, something cold and heavy. This had been here long before me. How old do you think they are? I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. Mitchell shook her head. We won't know for sure until forensics gets here, she said, exhaling sharply. But judging by the state of decomposition, decades, maybe longer, decades. Someone had buried a child beneath my driveway. Before I ever lived here, before the last owners. Before I even knew this house existed. Carter crouched again, reaching for the stack of photographs beside the bones. He lifted the first one carefully, holding it up to the light. A little girl stared back at us. Dark curls, a shy smile. She stood in front of a white house. My house, my breath caught. Mitchell flipped through the other photos, her expression hardening. The same child over and over again, some with a man and woman beside her, their faces slightly blurred from age. Others with a small dog, playing in the front yard. I swallowed. Who is she? Carter didn't answer immediately. He turned over one of the photos. There was something written on the back in faded ink. Margaret, 1967. Across the street, a door slammed. The three of us turned in unison. Margaret's door. She was gone. Blinds drawn, lights off, and that's when it hit me. She had called the cops because she thought I was doing something wrong. But the moment she realized what was actually buried under my driveway, she disappeared, and that told me everything I needed to know. The night felt colder now. Not just the kind of cold that brushed against your skin, the kind that settled deep, past the bones, past the soul. Carter kept flipping through the photos, his face unreadable. Mitchell took a step back, exhaling sharply. "This isn't just some missing person case," she muttered. "Somebody buried her here. Somebody put her under this driveway, like she was never supposed to be found." I looked back at Margaret's house, lights off, curtains drawn. But my gut told me she was still there, still listening. "She knows something." The words left my mouth before I even had time to think about them. Mitchell's gaze flickered toward the house, then back at me. She didn't disagree. Carter sighed, finally tucking the photos back into an evidence bag. "We'll be looking into the records, seeing who lived here before you. But right now, we need statements. You and her." He nodded toward Margaret's house. I didn't say it out loud, but I already knew how this was going to play out. Margaret wasn't coming outside. Margaret wasn't answering questions. Margaret wasn't going to admit a damn thing. Because this wasn't about some random 911 call. She was scared of what we found. The forensic team arrived within the hour, their floodlights turning my front yard into a crime scene. Officers marked off the area. The remains were carefully bagged, the photographs documented. My once quiet street now buzzed with police chatter and the occasional burst of static from their radios. I stood back, arms crossed, watching them work. But my mind kept circling back to that one name, Margaret, 1967. Who was she? What happened to her? And why was she buried here? Mitchell walked up beside me, keeping her voice low. "Records show the house was built in 1959. First owners were a couple named Richard and Eleanor Warren. The names meant nothing to me. I had never heard of them. Did they have any kids?" I asked. Mitchell hesitated, just for a second, and then, "One," she finally said. "A daughter, Margaret." The weight of it hit me like a punch to the gut. "You're telling me the people who lived here first, the very first owners, had a daughter named Margaret, and she—" "What disappeared?" Mitchell's expression darkened. "Not just disappeared," she said. "She was never reported missing. No records of a search, no police report, nothing." I turned my head toward Margaret's house. Thought back to her face when she saw what we found. The sharp retreat, the way she slammed her door shut. "How long has she lived here?" I asked. This time, Mitchell didn't hesitate. "Since 1972. I didn't say anything. I didn't have to. Because we both knew what this meant. Margaret Wilkins wasn't just a neighbor. She had been here across from this driveway for over 50 years. Which meant one of two things. Either she knew exactly what happened, or she knew who did it, and that's when I realized. This story was far from over. Margaret's house remained dark, no movement, no sound. Just the weight of a woman hiding behind thick curtains, pretending nothing had happened. But she knew. She had to know. The forensic team worked through the night, their floodlights casting long, unnatural shadows across my yard. The remains were carefully lifted from the box, every inch of the site documented and photographed. I sat on my porch, exhaustion creeping into my bones. At some point, Carter walked over, hands resting on his belt, his face unreadable. "We'll be running DNA. If we get a match, we'll know for sure who she was." But we already knew. Margaret, 1967, the little girl with dark curls, standing in front of my house in those faded photographs. I exhaled, and Lisa. Carter's gaze flickered toward her house, then back at me. "We'll question her. See if she remembers anything." But we both knew. She wouldn't talk, not easily, not after all these years. Mitchell stepped up beside us, holding her phone. "I checked old property records," she said. "Lisa's parents lived in that house before her. Moved in 2 years after Margaret disappeared. They both passed away in the early 90s, left her the home." Carter scratched his chin. "If her parents moved in right after the first family left ... I finished the thought for him. Then maybe they knew something. Mitchell nodded ... For a moment, none of us spoke. Just silence, heavy, unsettling, because this wasn't just about a buried box. This was about a girl who was supposed to be forgotten. I turned back toward Margaret's house, my fists clenching. She had been so quick to pick up the phone when she thought I was doing something suspicious. But when the truth came out, she hid. The irony wasn't lost on me. Carter exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. We'll keep digging, but in the meantime, get some rest. We'll keep you updated. Rest? How the hell was I supposed to do that? Because while the cops packed up for the night, while the floodlights faded and the voices died down, I knew one thing for sure. Margaret Wilkins wasn't scared of me that night. She was scared of what I found. Because sometimes, the things buried beneath our feet aren't just old secrets. They're truths that were never supposed to see the light of day. And the people who buried them, they're still watching, still waiting, still hoping that no one ever digs deep enough to find out the truth. But the truth has a way of coming back, and for Margaret Wilkins, I had a feeling this was only the beginning. Because sometimes the real crime isn't just what was done. It's how many people chose to stay silent. How many times do we ignore the truth because it's easier to pretend we didn't see it? How often do we turn a blind eye to the things that don't affect us? Until they do, the past never stays buried, and sooner or later, it comes back. Whether we're ready or not. What do you think Margaret knows? Drop your theories in the comments. Let's talk.